Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Human SOS Show. We're on episode 114, and we're going to talk about clarity in communication. Thanks to, I believe Zaid was the one that suggested it, and it's a good topic. So, Anton, you want to open us up today?
Absolutely. We actually do want to say that when we're going to have Lila here, we're going to touch on this topic twice. And I think what would you say, July 19th?
19th, uh-huh.
Yeah. So Lila is one of our good friends, but she's definitely an expert in this area, much bigger than me and Kevin are. So we were going to potentially do this in two parts, talk about it today. And if you have any questions or if we come up with anything that, we need to uncover deeper, we will use that time to go, into another level of this discussion. But we're going to be talking about clarity and communication, really focused on whether, we talk a lot about leadership, of course, whether this be a leader communicating to their teams, leader communicating upward, but also in relationships, right? In everyday life, how clear we are when we're speaking to others around us. And really starting off, the thing that pops into my mind, the I see an increase in passive aggressive communication on
Mhm.
one side, while on the other side, I see an increase in aggressive communication. I feel like it's one or the other. I feel like we're splitting the groups into two, areas, and some people are very angry, very frustrated, and they're attacking people when they're talking. While on the other hand, some people are very passive and they can't say something, very directly, and they beat around the bush, and finally they try to say something where you're like, is this really what you're saying, or is there more layers to that? Have you noticed that at all, Kevin?
Yeah, a lot of extremes. People, uh, again, just challenged to communicate based on their own personality and things. And I think it's because we have a lack of understanding of how to communicate effectively, and especially to communicate in a way that is not doesn't cause us to have to be ugly or nasty or whatever to get our point across. And so I think that's a factor in it. Let me give a couple of shout outs here. Welcome, Petro and Moses and Nuvera and William. Glad to have you with us today. And Sharon as well. Good morning. And so, yeah, it's definitely an issue that we're not effectively communicating, and we're seem to be in extremes, either an unwillingness to communicate because we're so uncomfortable, or over indexing to communicate and saying things ultimately that we don't need to say, or unwise in what they are.
I see this a lot when people deliver bad news. I've seen this from leaders, at least in my experience. They have to deliver some bad news, and or at least news that may negatively impact the team, and it's like said it under their breath, right? They'll cover a whole lot of stuff and then really quickly say it just to get out of the room as fast as they can, or they'll deliver the news and then try to kind of soften the blow a little bit and say, well, this is not going to be a big deal, and that's really bad to do as a leader,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, we as leaders, when we're communicating, or just anybody when we're communicating, one of the first things we want to do is put ourselves in the shoes of who's receiving that news and really come from a very empathetic standpoint. If that's bad news, how is it going to impact them? What is it going to do for their everyday life? Is this something that's potentially a threat to them or something like that? Like, does this make them worry about their job?
Mm.
May make them worry about making money that they're making. Is this going to impact the way they're making quota? Like, whatever it is, passive aggressive communication will just get people confused, and that's the worst. Like, when we have the precious little moments in a team meeting, we want to use that time to establish clarity, not dive into um, more murky waters. And I feel
Mm.
like when we deliver bad news like that as leaders, or some sort of impact to our teams, that doesn't really work very well. And then after that, people don't have time to start adjusting and pivoting or preparing. They're still kind of moving very, very slowly when we need to activate them to do whatever it is that we're telling them to do.
Yeah, and one of the things I was thinking about when we were going to talk about this was a basic understanding of what constitutes communication, effective communication, that is. And one of the things that I teach when I am training teachers and other teachers, I'm sorry, other trainers, excuse me, is there's a cycle involved. And the cycle starts with someone having a message, then giving the message to another person. And one of the key pieces we miss is just because we give it to them doesn't mean they always receive it. They have to receive that communication. And once they've received the communication, then they have to internalize it, have to do something with it for themselves. And then you have to work through any distractions that could be involved in that communication, language distractions, timing, different things. And then the other one that we miss quite often is, in order to know we've communicated effectively, we need feedback. That may be just a nod of the head or an acknowledgement that they understand, or it may be that we want them to, in certain situations, even give us feedback on the spot. And what we use in the military is called brief back. And I tell leaders all the time, use brief back. It's a very effective tool to make sure you've communicated well. But understand, communication is not just me saying something to someone else and them doing it. That's what we've come to think of communication as, but that's not a good understanding. And so, really consider all parts of the communication cycle as we go forward with how we do that. Shout out to Lydia and Zaid and Denise. Glad to have all of you with us today. And just a reminder, as Anton mentioned when we opened up, if you have questions, we're going to have a follow-on episode about communication with our good friend Lila Smith on the 19th. So if you have questions that you want to throw out that could even be beyond Anton and I's expertise, certainly Lila will be able to address those well. She's one of the best around in terms of communication. So, um,
I like the brief back, and I like how you're saying thinking about the person receiving it, and something to think about is context as well. Like, can we
mm,
create enough context around the communication that needs to be happening? Because a lot of times we forget that context is really important. You can say something very poorly without providing context, without meaning to make that kind of impact. So be careful when you're sending it out. And I feel like coming back to the point that I feel like some people are either getting aggressive with communication and some people are getting really passive with communication, right? Some people are so worried about the feelings on the receiving end, or how those people are going to think about it, or how, even worse, how those people are going to view the person sending the communication, that they won't send it with clarity. They'll send it with like a pillow attached to it to soften the blow, like I said, and that's not necessarily a good thing either. So it's sometimes you have to rip off the band-aid. If you got some
mm,
bad news, rip off the band-aid with clarity, reassure people that, hey, we are going to get past this, but this is something we're going to have to face. And at least at that point, people have to deal with it just really once emotionally, right? They hear it, they understand it. Yes, it's going to be a blow, but at the same time, they're not walking out of that meeting going, okay, is this a bad thing? Is this a good thing?
yeah,
They're confused, and now they're going to have to almost like relive that news multiple times instead of just kind of ripping that band-aid off and moving on.
yeah. And we all know when we get information that might not be complete or clear, we'll torture ourselves over that. We'll build monsters in our mind about the significance or non-significance of it, and much better to make it very clear. And if you want to soften the blow, if you will, then offer to walk through that situation with the person. Part of the problem is we do kind of a hit and run. Oh, by the way, here's this. See you later. Good luck with that. And if it's somebody that we are in relationship, whether a professional relationship or a personal relationship, walking through that with the person is uh, a softening of it as well. We're not just going to leave you there to process it, because when we stay around with them, figuratively and literally, we have the opportunity maybe to help them ask more questions, or so that they don't torture themselves in the process. And when we do incomplete communication or ineffective communication, for many people, that will cause them to be fearful or hesitant to do a communication next time because it doesn't go well. I mean, uh, getting bad news or hard news is not never easy, but it can go much better if it's done well, and that's the part that becomes critical. Uh,
I'm just curious for audience, like where do you see leaders struggling to deliver communication in a good way? Like in what settings and what environments do you see that happening? Outside of leadership, it's funny, but I feel like when couples break up, that's where there's some really bad communication happening all the time, right? You feel like this isn't probably more with kids, but maybe it's also with adults too. But like I feel like teenagers do this all the time. Like it's not me. I mean, it's not you. It's me, and like trying to really murky the waters to try to protect the other person, and then they're walking away really, really confused instead of being
mhm.
like, "Hey, we've grown apart. We're going on our separate way because things that we used to share in interest maybe is not what it is, or I'm not as interested as I was before. You're an amazing person, but this is just the way things needs to be." And I feel like a lot of times, especially like when I'm also thinking delivering communication to kids, and it's the same with adults, when we start to, tiptoe around the subject, um, our body language changes. It's almost
Mm.
like like you said, you kind of finish that story that's not being said in ways that's totally different, but our body language sends out these really poor signals, and then that story becomes a really bad story, and then people start blaming themselves and versus just a circumstantial thing. So where do you think these things are happening in society, or not society, but in workplace? Where are leaders doing this poorly?
Zaid has a comment here, and it took me a second to understand what his comment is. The nice culture communication is the worst I have encountered. Um, yeah, well, what do you think on that one, Anton? I'll see what your perspective of what nice culture is.
Nice culture is kind of what I was talking about, where everybody's softening the blow, or where it's this fake, overly nice, overly positive environment where people can't be direct with you. They can't let you know. It's when we're talking about this, this makes me think about the Radical Candor book by who is it? Is Kim Scott, and it's like I think there's like one that's like I forget what she calls it, but it's like empathy to an extreme, right? Where like we're so worried about somebody's feelings, we're so worried about what's happening. We may not even deliver a communication, or we may deliver only a piece of it and not really the whole thing because we're afraid of being perceived not nice, right? That's what the nice culture a lot of time comes from, is people that are afraid of being looked at as a villain, or a bad person or whatever. And I'm like, it's not the case. Sometimes reality occurs and real things have to be said, and we just need to rip that band-aid off and then help to heal the wound, right? You can't avoid, like, it's kind of a good analogy maybe to run with, is you can't avoid fixing problems. You just have to let people know about the problem, but still be supportive on the other end. Like you said, Kevin, walk them through the process of how it's going to work and how it's going to be better and how we're going to, minimize the impact to the team. But sometimes we just have to hit it head on.
Well, and I think another factor in our hesitance to um, speak clearly and to speak honestly is the lack of good culture for our team. If we're talking work situation or even other relationships, we don't have a developed good, solid relationship, which includes being able to be honest at times and not be a threat to the relationship. And when we don't have that environment that we're working with, Uh, One of the reasons we won't say anything is because we have to consider that it may destroy that relationship, whatever it is, work or personal, whatever. Whereas if you have a culture of open and honesty and trust that you're working with, saying hard things is much different than when you're not uh, working with that kind of culture. And so, how we build and establish our culture, our relationships become an important factor as well. And that's why, we see it in personal relationships. If we've got a good friend that we know and we have mutual respect, mutual love, and they're about to do something stupid, we don't hesitate quite often to look at them and say, "You realize that you're about to do something stupid." Whereas if we don't have a strong relationship, appropriate relationship, and we're fearful that whatever relationship we have is going to be damaged or destroyed, we're much more hesitant to speak honestly with people and openly. And that becomes another factor in good communication.
So as they'd say, I see it mostly at work settings because I'm not in control. Um, yeah, I mean, of course, but can Kevin, you're really good at leadership. Can people without position of leadership necessarily with the title, can they influence how people communicate and how their leaders communicate? Is that something, you talk about managing up and things like that? Like if we're struggling with that on a team and a leader is not setting the right example, how can we pivot as a team and improve our communication and maybe even get the leader to communicate a little better?
Oh, definitely. Even if we don't have titles, we can lead. And the key thing is by example, is that we don't give in to poor or ineffective communication examples. We become an example of good, effective communication. And what happens, especially in the absence of effective leadership, people will be drawn to it because we all want to have leadership in our lives, either ourselves leading us or others are leading us. And so we're drawn to the behaviors when people model them. And so, yes, we can influence it greatly if we are determined to be that example. And it can be difficult at times because is just not supported. And that is another characteristic of being an effective leader is to be able to lead and be example even when it's not easy or popular. So yes, definitely have the option to affect those around us. I have personally witnessed people uh, doing this, and I've even experienced it myself. I've been in situations where I was not in a leadership role in terms of title, and I was able to, by doing the right things and doing well, and including communication, immediately I had people drawn to me, and ultimately it led to me being put in positions of leadership as a result. So very effective, very
Zane's
effective.
got a follow-up comment there.
Yeah. Okay. Says that's if they care, but what you do if they don't care, but further their own career, farther their own career. Excuse me. Again, the most powerful thing we have as a person, as a parent, and these are leadership roles that are unofficial, if you will. They're not considered leadership roles even by title, but is our example, and our example can influence people and situations remarkably, even if they are not aware or don't care or even don't even think there's an issue. If you become that example, you will influence them. Or the potential is if you're effective in what you do and they're threatened enough, you may find that you need to be in another place, and that becomes evident as well. And but yeah, it can be done, and we should do it. when we do it, it's effective more times than not because there is such an absence of leadership and good communication. And welcome, Arfine. Glad to have you with us today.
Coaching up is hard. It definitely is, and it's sometimes dangerous. Sometimes you can try to coach up a person that has a really poor ego complex, and they're going to get defensive. So approaching it very gently, very slowly. But everybody cares about something, right? So they may not care about the team, but because you said they want to farther their career. So maybe when we're talking and coaching them up, it's not about discussing feelings and people and what impact it does to them. It's looking at it from a business standpoint, right? Looking at it from what is this style of communication doing to our team, right? If they're very, very aggressive, right? If that's the case, what is that doing to your team? Like, what is the outcome of that? If somebody's very aggressive as a communicator, it's usually going to create defensiveness. Like, that's one of the biggest things that I see is that happens from people. And then maybe when we're talking to them, like painting them a picture. Usually these people that don't care, they're going to be they're going to be lacking awareness in the impacts and really the big picture of what that did. So sit there and play them out a picture of what their overly aggressive communication created for the team and how that's impacting the business, right? Notice I have to tie it right back into how that's impacting the business, how it's impacting the bottom line, how it's impacting quota, how it's impacting whatever, the side of business that you're in, and show them, like, can we try to do it this way? Like, and because if we do, this is the positive impact we're going to see on the business. And if they want to advance their career, as you said, they will care about that side. On the other side, if somebody's overly passive, right, and if they're really nice, that creates a lot of ignorance from the team. They don't care because they can't get any clarity. They don't see any, real outcomes from that. They're just kind of like, all right, in one ear, out the other. They stop caring because we're overly nice. Nothing bad's ever happening. Like, nothing real is ever being said. So it's like, I'm coming to this meeting just because I have to, but the reality is I'm getting nothing out of it. So I'm checked out. So once again, that's going to impact the business. So try to come back to that impact to help them start changing.
Well, one of the things, and this is so often missed, and it's a concept I've learned over the years, including reading a book called Creative Followership by Jimmy Collins of Chick-fil-A fame. And one of the things he talks about is that going into a position under a leader, one of the best things that we need to do and is to go to that leader and say, okay, one of my primary functions as part of your team is to help you look good and succeed. That is why part of why I'm here. That is a motivator here. And when we can lay that as a foundation and understand it's not always a feeling, it's something, it's a choice. But when we lay that foundation, then we have set up the tone for that interaction. And the other piece, and this is another missed part of communication, communication is not just verbal. We communicate lots with our actions. In fact, one of the things when I train leaders and we talk about safety and learning, is more of that is caught rather than taught. Being that example is so powerful without ever having to say a word. And especially if you've got a leader that you're working under and you've already laid the groundwork that you want them to be successful, and you are going about what you're doing and doing it all non-verbally, then you set up a whole different scenario than approaching them for correction. What I find is that if you do those two things, they more times than not will come to you and say, okay, you've got something here going on good. Tell me about it. So you open the door without ever having to force it or push for it by being that example and putting yourself in a role as an effective follower. And I know that's real unpopular in our current world. I'm not following anybody kind of mindset, but The reality is we all follow somebody and something most all the time. Question is who we do that for and how we go about it. And if we're excellent in what we do, it impacts how others see us. Yes, sometimes people are going to be threatened and react. And then at that point, if you're in that environment, for me, I'm going, do I need to stay in this environment? This may not be where I need to be because it's going to be unhealthy for me. And so just remember that nonverbal communication can be one of the best ways to affect others in a good way and be able to uh, influence them so that maybe they will get better at what we're talking about, which in this case is effective communication.
As I'm hearing you say the word environment, that's one of the very important things we must consider when we're communicating. What environment are we delivering this in? Right? Who are these people that are hearing this? What level of relationship do I have with them? What level of trust is established? And that should tell you somewhat how to tailor the communication, because a group of people that are your friends, that love you, care for you, maybe a certain way of talking than you would to somebody that's strangers, and you know they've never heard you, them have a certain baseline of relationship with you. So think about those kind of things when you're delivering that communication, to be clear, because once again, that context will change, lots of different things will change. And I think about I'm curious, Kev, who do you think is like examples of great communicators as professions? Like, if it's a weird question because one just popped into my mind that I feel like have to be good communicators when it comes down to clarity. Anybody come to mind with a profession that's really good at being a clear communicator?
Well, I'll have to approach this one carefully because this was, in my mind, it's professional, but some will see only the political angle of it. But one of the effective traits of Ronald Reagan as a president was his ability to communicate. He lacked in a number of ways with some things, but one of the powers uh, that he used well was his effective communication and being able to even help those that disagreed with him understand what's going on to a point of even changing their thoughts and minds on it. So that's one that comes to mind. And the other one, in a broader sense, is coaches, sports coaches. Those that learn how to be effective communicators are seen as leaders, not just coaches. And we, throughout history, that's been an example of good leadership for us because they were about leading their team rather than managing their team.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly who came to my mind. I was thinking of great sports coaches that, inspired through communication, but they also, reprimanded through communication. They did it all over the place, and they did it well. And the reason I bring that up is oftentimes professionally, we tend to stick in our little bubble of people like us or environments like us when learning things. And I encourage you as professionals to get out of that, like go to a profession that's very different from yours and see how some of these people do it very well. If you watch sports coaches communicate, you're going to become a better communicator, because these folks, you have to think about it, right? Some of these sports coaches, they've never played a sport that they are coaching, and that's tough. Like, that is really, really tough. Or they were never really successful at the level that some of these grown professional athletes are, able to be successful at. So they have to walk this really fine line of like being able to reprimand somebody, tell them to do something differently, but at the same time being able to have the relationship to inspire them, to trust them. So if you really want to go and learn how to be better, watch some documentaries, observe some coaches, on the bench, watch the nonverbal communication sometimes. I think those are the best examples in my mind as far as people that we can learn from that may not pop into our heads as good examples of it.
Yeah. Welcome, Ed Mario, and appreciate it. And Arfine has a comment. Comment is the concept of communication is based on how well education is done or gained by the two communicated sides. And uh, and I am what my perspective on that, or I tell you what, Anton, what are your thoughts on that one?
How well education done game by the two communication side. Um, I'm assuming he's talking about as like, are we assessing the communication, right? Is this what we're getting at? Where, Arthina, you saying like we're judging whether communication was done well or not, or is this like how educated both people are? I'm going with the fact that we're assessing and the quality of the communication, and I think ultimately, yes, that's 100% correct, because we got to see how well was that message delivered. Was the message delivered in a way that has added value to something, or provided clarity that's needed to accomplish a task, right? It's like the telephone game that we're talking about, sending out that message. Was it received exactly how it was meant to be, and did it create the impact that was it intended to deliver, or did it become jumbled up, or now something has happened where we sent it out, we thought we sent it out correctly, but on the other end it's incomplete. People had to fill in the gaps, and now it's not the quality that was before.
Yeah, I could see that. The other side that I was kind of thinking of is in communication, we need to have some common ground or equal level playing field, if we will, to be able to communicate well. And one of those is use of language. Are we are both parties able to even understand the language that we use at the same level? If you have someone that is less formally educated, by the way, it doesn't mean that they are somehow less than. It just means maybe they are not as much formally educated. The way you choose your words become very important, so that you're both on the same level in that communication. Because if you're not, you end up creating more confusion, because you start talking, one will talk about something, the other doesn't get it, and rather than even admit that they don't get it, they just get upset or angry, or and then it digresses from there. And so I think it's good that we find common ground on, in terms of just actual communication and language, that we need to be at the same place. An example, okay, in a job world, if the leader is dealing with an understanding of things at a higher level and comes into one of their team members and starts talking at that level with the uh, person that's on their team, the person may not even understand technical terms, or uh, situational terms and things like that, and it causes confusion and so on. So let's see here. It looks like Arfine has added additional comment here. It says, I made dozens of correspondence and communications as a procurement buyer with European vendors every day, often finding it easy and clear. On the other hand, I find it difficult to communicate with my internal work environment, though we use same native language. Uh, yeah, I am. And when I talk about language, I'm not even necessarily talking about our native language, but even the language of our job, technical terminology, and also context of the situation. And so, yes, I mean, effective communication can even, I believe, overcome people's language barriers from terms of native language. Thoughts on a follow up there, Anton?
Well, I'm gonna just leave this, and I'm gonna have to apologize, folks. I gotta jump to a work call, but it's established. Like in the first environment where you're talking about being a procurement buyer, there's an established baseline that people can reference, right? There's something that both parties can come back to and say, here's the baseline that we can discuss. Very easy, very simple, much easier to communicate clearly when that's the case. when communicating with other people, we're not communicating often to a very established baseline. Different people have different interpretation of different, of the same statement, and it becomes a lot more difficult. So yes, I think professional communication, discussing things, is much easier than discussing ideas and feelings and impacts with people, when it's outside of just basic baselines. But I apologize, folks. I got to run. I got a call starting. So, thanks so much. I'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, Kev.
See you later, Anton. So, again, a key to communication is a baseline of understanding, whether it be an educational level or a technical understanding at our work, whatever it is. Having that baseline or common ground is important. And it's a good idea for us to work to establish those baselines with people that we need to work with. That's why what Anton was talking about earlier, context. And when we, part of that baseline is establishing context for the conversation. When we have that context, it saves a lot of misunderstanding, or saves people reacting, assuming a wrong motivation. A lot of times, the problem we have with clarity of communication is if there is any unclarity, the assumed motivations involved. And so that becomes real important. And Mario, I see your comment. I'm not sure I understand the language it's written in, and maybe that's part of the point you're making, is that we can communicate, and if we're not talking the same language in lots of ways, maybe we won't get it. So if you'll give us the translation, maybe maybe we can address it. So communication, effective communication, is a key component that we need to work on. Involves a lot of different pieces. One of them is the context of how we're offering it, and the culture that we're offering it in. If we have a strong culture, strong work relationship in our culture, then being able to be honest, as Anton referenced, radically candid, becomes much more likely, and the effects of that radical candor become more effective because we have the culture, the relationships to be able to share it. Another one is, as we communicate, especially if it's something of import, we want to consider, unless it has to be dealt with in an urgent fashion, which most of the time is not something that has to be, especially if it's a problem situation, is to really consider our words, and consider not just the words we're going to use, but the connotations that go with those words. Because some words, if they're used in a purely face value or generic sense, have one meaning. But if we use some words with the connotations that go with them, we then create emotional responses rather than logical communication responses. So considering our words, and then again, what we talked about earlier, nonverbal communication. One of the things when I train trainers or train leaders, I make sure that that they understand the importance of us knowing nonverbal communication and what that expresses, because you could say all the right words and your nonverbal communication either support it and make it stronger, or add confusion. And that includes facial expressions, that includes tonation of our voice, and so on. I can't think of a good example right now, but we know of certain phrases that we say, depending on the intonation that we use with those, what we say can make that same exact phrase have very different meanings. So considering our nonverbal component of our communication becomes a huge factor. And understanding what communication is. There is a cycle of sending, receiving, internalizing, and then giving feedback. And if we're going to be effective in communication, we, as much as possible, we need that whole cycle to occur. Because if we don't allow time for internalizing, then people are forced to react rather than respond. And then if we don't watch or seek out feedback, we do not know if we've effectively communicated. So a lot of different components to it. And of course, the one that most of us, I would suggest, have a great struggle with, and we may or may not acknowledge, is listening. Because quite often, our lack of listening will create a situation where we will miscommunicate. I've done this myself by not listening, and listening is beyond using just our ears. Effective listening is using our eyes and our ears and even our intuition or our soul or whatever. And when we are attuned to that, we are going to respond differently. And one of the situations I was in with a teacher, as a teacher, was with a student that normally has one set of behaviors. They happen to be good behaviors, and something caused them to act out of what their character had normally been. And without me thinking it through and listening and observing, I reacted. And short version is that I did not get to some of the factors. And it turns out this student's father had passed away within days of his behaviors. And had I been more observant, listening, if you will, then I probably would have had a better chance of responding to his behaviors in the right way rather than not correctly. Welcome, Rick. Glad to have you with us. Rick's got a comment. Says, unfortunately, we have created a generation that does communicate verbally. I think you meant doesn't communicate verbally. They only communicate through devices. Yes, that has been one of the downsides of technology. Technology has a lot of positives, but one of the downsides is that we have created people that have become ineffective in clear communication at various levels. And that is a real challenge for us. Let's see. I think maybe Ed Mario has elaborated on or translated his earlier comments, way I'm taking it anyway. Taking into account the dynamic and sometimes unstable economic scenarios we've been following, corporate education is fundamental for the success of large and small companies. Today, one of the biggest challenges for all corporations is to keep their employees engaged and motivated with their work and with the company so that they earn more and bring more benefits, not only in financial terms, but also in terms of organizational climate and productivity. And that's where corporate, let's see here, that's where corporate education comes in. Yes, we've got to not assume, period, because we aren't at the same place in terms of workforce that we were in the past, and not taking into account that and including what Ed Mario is talking about, workforce education or corporate education is something that has to be part of what we do as a leader. Even if the company doesn't do that or make it a priority, a wise leader will make it a point to provide their team corporate education, and not necessarily talking about formal teaching, but rather understanding of the corporation and all about it and so on. Don't assume that others get it, and have that context as we communicate. So, since Anton had to take off and had work demands, I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up this morning, or today. I'm sorry. I know morning is a relative concept since we've got folks from all over, but we want to really learn how to be effective and clear communicators. Such an important thing for any of us, because this not only is a factor from a business standpoint, it's a factor for personal standpoint, relationships, and so on, and how to be effective in influencing the things around us even. And so we've talked a little bit about some basics and all. And 2 weeks from now, we're going to have one of the best communication coaches come and join us. She's agreed to, a good friend of ours, Lila Smith. And so we will break it down further into nuances. And it's really remarkable. I've actually been coached by Lila, and she is really great in helping us understand not just the words and even nonverbal, but understanding the relationships in communication. And that can be a real factor as well. So we'll have her here on the 19th with us, and we'll delve into it deeper. In the meantime, I hope that each of you will have picked up something you can use today, and you'll take it and use it to grow in your communications. And have an amazing week. We'll be back on next Tuesday as well, and we might even look at communication in other lights. We'll see. Anton and I will talk about it. But the idea is we want to keep on a theme of communication because it is so critical. And then when Lila joins us, then we can really be able to get some additional great insight into it. So take care, everyone. Have an amazing week, and we'll see you next Tuesday at 8 o'clock Eastern, and as we talk further about communication. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here and commenting. Look forward to seeing you later. God bless.